Every generation inherits two things, its country and its conscience. For Kenya, both have always been tested. From the streets of Bondo to the corridors of power, one man has stood as both witness and warning: Raila Amolo Odinga. Born of legacy, forged in resistance, defined by conviction. He is not just a politician. He is a question, asked again and again by history itself. Can a man fight for freedom without losing faith in the system? This is not the story of a man alone. It is the story of a nation learning how to breathe. A nation caught between memory and modernity. A people searching for truth beyond tribe and justice beyond elections. It is the story of Kenya and of every African dream that refuses to die. Raila Odinga, The Unfinished Revolution. A 10-part cinematic reflection on courage, conviction, and the cost of freedom. Told by Bright Tales Books, stories that illuminate Africa.
There are men who fight for power, driven by ambition and the desire for control, and then there are men who fight for a profound purpose, guided by principles and a vision for a better future. This compelling story, the first chapter of an unfinished revolution, begins with the latter kind of man, one whose life was dedicated to a higher calling beyond mere political gain. Long before his name resonated through massive rallies and dominated national headlines, he was simply known as the son of Jaramogi, a young boy from Bondo. He carried the weight of history in his very blood, inheriting a legacy deeply intertwined with Kenya's struggle for self-determination and justice. His father, the revered Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, Kenya's first vice president, instilled in him a fundamental truth: that true independence is hollow without genuine justice. He taught his son that a flag, no matter how proudly hoisted, remains merely a piece of cloth if it does not represent a foundation of fairness and equity for all citizens. From his father, he also learned the profound lesson that truth often walks a solitary path, frequently standing alone against popular opinion or entrenched power. Leadership, he discovered through observation and early experience, is not about seeking applause or fleeting popularity, but about enduring challenges and maintaining steadfast resolve. While comfort and compromise tempted many others, Jaramogi consistently chose the more arduous road, prioritizing principles over personal ease.
Raila absorbed this crucial lesson deeply, that political power may ultimately fade, but unwavering conviction and moral integrity endure as timeless forces.
He did not inherit material wealth or vast fortunes. Instead, he inherited the deep wounds of a nation's past struggles and the profound courage required to confront them.
He understood that these historical scars needed to be reopened and examined, not to inflict further pain, but so the country might finally heal and move forward. By the time he formally entered the tumultuous arena of politics, the established system already harbored a deep-seated fear of what his very name represented. His name evoked the powerful memory of past injustices and the daunting prospect of unfinished work, a revolution yet to be completed. In the oppressive 1980s, when an impalpable atmosphere of fear and repression thickened the air across Kenya, Raila Odinga actively organized and courageously resisted the authoritarian regime.
For his unwavering commitment to democracy and justice, he paid a heavy price, enduring years of imprisonment and hardship.
The solitary walls of his prison cell were intended to erase his revolutionary ideas and break his spirit, but instead, they served to refine his convictions. Outside, grand parades and official speeches were orchestrated to drown out any form of dissent, creating a facade of unity and control. Inside the confines of his incarceration, however, his deep conviction learned the invaluable virtue of patience, strengthening his resolve for the long fight ahead. To the outside world, he appeared to be just another political dissident, one among many who challenged the status quo. But to the people of Kenya, he was much more. He was a powerful mirror reflecting their own struggles, their own hopes, and their own unyielding spirit. When he was unjustly imprisoned, ordinary Kenyans saw their own metaphorical chains, feeling the weight of oppression alongside him. And when he was finally released, they saw not just his freedom, but a beacon of their own hope for a democratic future.
a nation collectively learned a vital lesson that true democracy is never simply gifted by those in power, but must be insisted upon, fought for, and continuously defended by its citizens. As he would later eloquently state, even in the darkest hours of the night, amidst despair and uncertainty, a revolution can still dream of its ultimate triumph.
Thus began a lifelong journey for Raila Odinga, not as a man merely chasing political titles or personal glory, but as a steadfast witness. He became the enduring embodiment of a nation's unfinished revolution, carrying its aspirations and struggles forward with unwavering dedication. History doesn't just remember what a man said. It remembers what he endured and what he refused to surrender.
For Raila Amolo Odinga, the price of conviction was not paid in currency, but in years. Years stolen, years silenced, years measured not by clocks, but by interrogations, isolation, and the echo of boots in corridors.
It began with whispers, meetings in dark corners, pamphlets printed on borrowed paper, and a government so afraid of its own citizens that it called courage a crime. When the 1982 coup attempt rattled the nation, the regime found its excuse. A convenient story, a convenient scapegoat. Raila Odinga was accused of treason, a word that could hang a man. They came before dawn. No warning, no warrant. Just the heavy knock of power at the door. Behind him, his children watched. Before him, his captors smiled. And in that moment, a chapter of silence began. Prison is supposed to break the body, but in Raila's case, it became the forge that hardened the spirit. He was thrown into solitary confinement, a room too small for movement, too quiet for sanity.
They thought isolation would erase his ideas. Instead, it refined them. Days became months. Months became years. And the world outside kept turning elections, parades, new speeches from the same men who feared him.
Sometimes he would whisper to himself, not in madness, but in memory. He recited his father's words, even if they lock the body, the idea must walk free.
By the mid-1980s, stories of Kenya's political prisoners began to leak out. Amnesty International wrote letters. The BBC whispered names the regime wanted buried. And the world began to hear of a man whose silence spoke louder than propaganda.
To the Western press, Raila became a symbol of resistance. To Kenyans, he became a warning and a hope. Because if a man could endure that much pain and still stand, then maybe Kenya could too.
They moved him from one prison to another, Kamatai, Shimo La Tewa, Naivasha, trying to erase his will. They banned his books. They tortured his friends. They kept him in the dark.
But the darker it became, the brighter his conviction burned. In his mind, he began to rewrite the map of Kenya, not with borders, but with values, freedom, justice, equality.
He had no pen, but he wrote history in silence. He had no podium, but he built a movement in whispers.
When he was finally released, without trial, without apology, Kenya was still under the shadow of fear. He walked out thinner, quieter, but not broken.
Reporters asked him how he survived. He smiled, the half smile that carried both pain and peace, and said, "You don't survive prison. You transform inside it."
That was the moment Raila Odinga became more than his father's son. He became Kenya's conscience, a living reminder that democracy is not gifted, it is fought for again and again. Thus, the revolution endured behind bars beyond pain, inside the heart of a man who refused to forget what freedom feels like.
Freedom had been promised, but in the Kenya of the 1980s, that promise still wore chains. One party, one voice, one fear that ruled them all. The prisons had opened their doors, but the nation itself was still a cell. And Raila Amolo Odinga, fresh from years of confinement, stepped back into the light not as a free man, but as a witness who refused to be silent. He joined hands with others who dared to imagine multi-party democracy, figures like Kenneth Matiba, Charles Rubia, and George Eniona. They were mocked, threatened, followed, but their message grew louder than fear. In markets, whispers turned to songs. In churches, sermons became speeches. In the universities, students chanted the forbidden word, change. The regime responded as it always did with tear gas and batons. But ideas, once released, cannot be arrested. Across the country, Raila walked, talked, and taught, reminding Kenyans that democracy was not a gift from government, but a right written in the soul of every citizen. He spoke in small halls, in hushed tones, teaching people that courage could be contagious. The world began to take notice again. Foreign press called it Kenya's slow awakening. Human rights groups called it the Second Liberation. In 1991, under mounting pressure, the government finally bowed to history. The single-party system was repealed. Kenyans would once again have the right to choose. The streets exploded in song. Flags waved not for a party, but for possibility. It felt like dawn. But dawn, as Raila knew too well, is only the beginning of the day's work. The new era came with old habits. Power still clung to its privileges. Corruption wore a new shirt, but the same smile. Raila entered the arena fully, not as a son of legacy, but as a soldier of reform. He built networks, parties, and movements. He challenged elections he knew were flawed, not for ambition, but for accountability. He understood that democracy is not an event, it's maintenance, struggle, and sacrifice. By the mid-1990s, Kenya had changed forever. The fear had cracked. The people had found their voice. Raila Odinga had helped light that flame, walking, speaking, and bleeding beside the people. He proved that a nation can be rebuilt not by miracles, but by men and women who refuse to give up. The prisons were behind him, but the revolution still walked ahead, waiting for the next chapter, the next generation, the next unfinished task.
There comes a time when a man stops fighting to win and starts fighting to prove that truth still matters. For Raila Amolo Odinga, that moment came in two words that shook Kenya: the 2007 election. The world was watching. Observers arrived with clipboards and cameras, hopeful, expectant, believing that Kenya would become Africa's success story. The mood was electric. Raila's movement, the Orange Democratic Movement, ODM, had swept across the nation like a wave of faith. Crowds filled stadiums. Flags waved. Songs rose like prayer. For the first time, ordinary people believed the system could finally bend toward justice.
But when the votes were counted, hope was hijacked. Results delayed. Numbers shifted. The night grew heavy with confusion.
Then, suddenly, a hurried swearing-in ceremony at State House, done in darkness, sealed in disbelief. Kenya cracked open. What began as disbelief turned into rage. Neighborhoods burned. Churches fell silent. Families fled homes they had lived in for generations. Ethnic lines hardened like walls of smoke. And at the center stood Raila, refusing to surrender, refusing to incite. He called for truth, but truth was drowned by the noise of machetes and gunfire.
Over 1,000 Kenyans died. Thousands more were displaced. It was not just an election stolen. It was innocence.
Then came the mediators. Kofi Annan arrived calm, firm, bearing the weight of a continent's shame. Weeks of secret talks, nights of silent prayer, and finally, the National Accord, a deal to share power. A fragile peace born of necessity. In 2008, Raila Odinga became Prime Minister of Kenya. The people celebrated, but deep down, he knew you cannot share justice, you can only delay it. Still, he chose the harder path. He worked within the system that once silenced him, building roads, reforms, and reconciliation.
He turned power into partnership and anger into agenda. Years later, the pattern would repeat. 2013, 2017. Elections contested, promises recycled, dreams deferred. But Raila refused to disappear. He went to the Supreme Court and history was made.
For the first time in Africa, a presidential election was nullified. The world cheered. Justice had spoken. But in the rematch, he refused to legitimize a process still poisoned by power. Then, in January 2018, Raila Odinga did the unthinkable. Before a sea of citizens in Uhuru Park, he lifted a Bible and took an oath, not as challenger, but as the people's president. There were no soldiers, no violence, just faith, flags, and a voice that refused to fade.
It was not about victory. It was about visibility. A nation reclaiming its right to be heard.
The government called it treason. The people called it courage. For that single day, the man who had spent decades fighting for democracy became the living symbol of it. And though the system tried to erase the moment, it could not erase the meaning. That day, Kenya remembered who it was. The oath was not a rebellion. It was a reminder that power belongs to the people and legitimacy begins with truth. Raila Odinga stood not as a conqueror, but as a conscience. The people's president. The man who carried Kenya's unspoken hope on his back once again. After years of battles, ballots, and betrayals, the nation was tired. You could hear it in the silence after the rallies, a profound weariness settling across the land. You could see it in the eyes of the youth too young to vote, but old enough to lose faith in the political process and their future. Kenya was broken, not by defeat, but by exhaustion, a deep-seated fatigue from continuous political strife and uncertainty. And then, on a warm March morning in 2018, something no one expected happened, shifting the political landscape dramatically. The cameras rolled, capturing every moment of anticipation. The gates of Harambee House, a symbol of power, opened wide.
And two men, once bitter rivals, walked toward each other, their steps measured and deliberate.
William Ruto watched from the wings, an observer to this historic moment. The press held its breath, sensing the gravity of the situation. The world blinked, momentarily stunned by the unexpected reconciliation unfolding before their eyes.
Raila Odinga, the seasoned opposition leader, and Uhuru Kenyatta, the sitting president, extended their hands.
The nation gasped, a collective intake of breath as the significance of the gesture registered across Kenya. The handshake. For some, it was relief, a long-awaited respite from political turmoil. For others, it was betrayal, a stark contradiction to years of struggle and sacrifice. To Raila's loyal supporters, men and women who had marched, been tear-gassed, and buried friends in his name, the handshake felt like heartbreak. Was it peace or surrender? Had the fighter finally bowed to the system he swore to change? But for Raila, it was not about surrender. It was about survival, not his own, but Kenya's, a nation on the brink. He saw a nation once spark away from collapse, a fragile state teetering on the edge.
He saw history repeating itself, and he refused to let Kenya burn again, determined to break the cycle.
So he reached across the divide, not to embrace power, but to rescue peace, a selfless act for the greater good.
It was a political ceasefire, but also a personal rebirth, a new chapter in his long career. For the first time in decades, he walked into State House not as a prisoner, but as a partner, if only for a while. The handshake birthed the Building Bridges Initiative, BBI, a bold promise to fix the cracks that elections had revealed.
Constitutional reforms, inclusive leadership, shared prosperity, these were the pillars of the BBI's vision.
A Kenya where no tribe would ever feel left behind again, a truly unified nation. It was ambitious, idealistic, and controversial, sparking intense debate across the country. Some called it visionary, a path to a better future. Others called it vanity, a self-serving political maneuver. But to Raila Odinga, it was the unfinished revolution wearing a new suit, an attempt to build peace from the same stones that once built prisons.
BBI sparked hope, igniting optimism among many Kenyans for a more stable future.
It also sparked resistance, leading to significant opposition and challenges. Court battles, rallies, rumors. The initiative faced a barrage of challenges from various fronts. As always in Kenya, change came wrapped in fear, a familiar companion to political transformation. Yet, even as politicians turned reform into rivalry, Raila stood by his belief that no nation can heal by pretending its wounds don't exist. But peace built on politics is fragile, susceptible to shifting alliances and ambitions. When Uhuru's term neared its end, the handshake began to fray, its initial strength diminishing. The partners drifted, their paths diverging. The promises blurred, losing their initial clarity and impact. And once again, the people were left asking, was it handshake or heartbreak?
For Raila, it was both, a complex legacy of achievement and disappointment.
He gave Kenya a moment of calm, a chance to breathe, a vision of unity, even if temporary. It was not the victory he imagined, but it was the peace he needed to protect, a crucial safeguard for the nation.
Sometimes revolutions don't end in fireworks, grand and explosive displays of triumph.
They end in handshakes, quiet agreements that reshape the future in subtle ways. Because even unfinished revolutions must learn how to rest, finding peace in their ongoing journey. Every revolution meets its mirror. For Raila Odinga, that mirror was not a foreign enemy, but a familiar student of the system, William Samoei Ruto.
They had once stood together, hand in hand, united against power. Now, years later, they stood on opposite ends of history, each claiming to fight for the people.
Kenya's most watched election. The stage was set, the alliances redrawn, the country weary of promises and propaganda.
Uhuru Kenyatta, the president who once opposed Raila, now stood beside him, calling him my brother. The handshake had evolved into an endorsement.
But in politics, loyalty has an expiry date. William Ruto, once the deputy, turned rebellion into religion. He spoke the language of the hustler, a gospel of grievance, a sermon for the streets. The campaign became a battlefield of narratives. Ruto promised bottom-up. Raila promised Azimio la Umoja, unity. It was a contest between old wounds and new hopes, between memory and momentum. And yet, behind the speeches and slogans, lay the same question Kenya had asked for 60 years. Who really owns this republic, the rulers or the ruled?
Raila campaigned across the country, his voice older, his eyes still burning with belief. He spoke not of revenge, but of legacy, of finishing what his father began. Crowds still filled the roadsides, singing his name, holding his portraits high like family photographs. But deep down, even his loyalists could feel the fatigue of history.
How many times can a nation rise and fall on the same dream? Then came the night of the count. Screams flickered. Tension filled the air like thunder.
And once again, the numbers split the nation. The Electoral Commission fractured live on television. One half certified the results. The other half walked out in protest.
The winner, William Ruto. The loser, Raila Odinga again. Outside, fireworks. Inside, disbelief. History, it seemed, had chosen irony over justice. For Raila, it was not just defeat, it was déjà vu. A repetition of pain wrapped in the language of democracy. He contested the outcome, as always in courts, not in chaos. But the verdict was the same, upheld. The hustler had become the president. The reformer had become the elder. And yet, this was not the end. Because revolutions are not about winning, they're about awakening. Raila Odinga had already planted his idea deep in the soil of a new generation, Gen Z, the digital children of struggle, who film injustice, tweet resistance, and protest not with machetes, but with hashtags and hope.
They're the sons and daughters of his defiance. They're the proof that history was not wasted. As Raila steps back from the front lines, the story continues not in Parliament, but in the people.
The revolution is no longer his alone. It is ours. Ongoing. Unfinished. The baton has passed from the man who marched in streets to a generation marching online, but for the same freedom. So if you ask, was Raila Odinga defeated? No. He was delivered into the memory of a nation he helped build and into the hearts of citizens he helped awaken. Because in Kenya, even when elections end, the revolution continues unfinished, but alive. Every story has an ending. But some endings are not conclusions, they are beginnings that refuse to die. For more than half a century, Raila Amolo Odinga walked the hard road of Kenyan politics, from prison cells to parliament, from exile to ballots, from heartbreak to handshake. He did not always win power, but he always won purpose. In a country that often forgets its heroes, Raila remains unforgettable, not because of titles, but because of truth.
He was not perfect.
He made alliances that angered some and decisions that divided others. But through every twist and betrayal, he carried one stubborn belief, that Kenya could still become what it was meant to be.
A nation of fairness, a country where justice wears no tribe, a republic where leadership serves and history heals. Today, Raila stands not as the opposition, but as an institution, a living archive of the Kenyan struggle, proof that democracy is not a destination, but a discipline.
He taught us that courage is not shouting in rallies, but standing in silence when you are the only one left.
He showed that defeat, when carried with dignity, can teach a nation more than victory won by deceit.
And most of all, he proved that freedom is not a gift governments grant, but a fire people must guard. Look around Kenya today. Listen to the voices of the young. See their art, their protests, their laughter.
They may not call themselves revolutionaries, but their courage is the echo of his. Every time a Kenyan demands accountability, records a protest on a phone, or speaks truth to power, that is Raila's revolution still breathing.
Unfinished, unbroken, unforgettable, history will write many names, but only a few will write history back. Raila Odinga was one of them.
He carried Kenya's conscience through storms and seasons, and though the crown never sat on his head, the country sits forever on his heart.
The unfinished revolution was never about one man. It was about all of us, our stubborn hope, our fragile peace, our refusal to stop dreaming. Because nations are not built in elections. They are built in the quiet choices of citizens who keep believing when belief becomes costly. So wherever this story finds you, in the city, the village, or the diaspora, remember this. You are part of that unfinished revolution. Carry it, protect it, continue it.
Freedom used to be a march. Now it is a hashtag. Once it was voices in the streets. Now it is thumbs on a screen. But the dream is the same: to be heard, to be seen, to matter. In Raila Odinga's time, freedom was physical. You risked prison, exile, or death. You hid leaflets under shirts, whispered truth in coded words, and prayed that one day the world would notice. Today, freedom is digital. A protest can begin with a post. A revolution can be streamed live. A government can fall from a tweet. The struggle moved from the streets of Nairobi to the screens of Nairobi. But here lies the danger. The same technology that liberates can also manipulate. The same phone that records injustice can spread lies. The same internet that connects the world can drown truth in noise. So the question is no longer, can we speak? It is, can we think? Raila Odinga fought a regime of silence. Today's youth fight a regime of distraction. The old prison had bars. The new one has algorithms. Both are designed to keep people controlled, one through fear, the other through forgetfulness. But the answer remains the same: consciousness. Freedom without awareness is just a different kind of cage. In the digital age, protest no longer wears uniforms. It wears creativity. It dances. It codes. It memes. It builds apps instead of barricades. And that is where the revolution continues. Raila's generation marched with banners. Gen Z marches with bandwidth. Both march for justice. One fought for multi-party democracy. The other fights for multi-platform truth. But remember this: technology is not the revolution. People are. Freedom does not live in Wi-Fi. It lives in willpower. It lives in the quiet decision to refuse corruption, to think before sharing, to vote before complaining, to care before clicking. Raila Odinga's story is a mirror not just of Kenya, but of all of us learning how to be free again. The revolution never died. It just changed devices. And every time a young Kenyan uses their voice, their art, their vote, or their technology to demand honesty, that is Raila's revolution finding a new frequency. Because freedom is not past tense. It is present continuous. It must be reimagined, rewritten, and reshared in every generation. And maybe that is the final lesson of the unfinished revolution, that no one ever truly finishes it. We only take turns keeping it alive.
Freedom has many borders, some drawn on maps, others within our souls. For Raila Odinga, it meant fighting for Kenya. Born January 7th, 1945, Raila dedicated his life to democracy, justice, and equality, leaving an indelible mark.
For millions in the diaspora, freedom means remembering Kenya, even as passports change and distance grows.
The diaspora, not exile, but an extension, witnesses to a dream still traveling, united by shared memory. From London to Atlanta, Doha to Johannesburg, Kenyans watch home through their screens. The question, when will Kenya finally become fair, echoes a deep desire for justice. They live where taxes build roads and justice keeps time. Yet, hearts beat to Kenya's rhythm, taught resilience through chaos. They send money, share headlines, argue online, actively participating in their homeland's narrative. The revolution asks for service, a deeper commitment to progress. Every Kenyan abroad is an ambassador of unfinished work.
Raila's struggle built a bridge. The diaspora must become the traffic.
Not just remitting money, but returning innovative ideas. Not just posting, but actively participating in initiatives. Not just watching, but actively building a better Kenya. New leadership comes from living rooms, laptops, and learning. Young minds merge home wisdom with global systems. The next Raila, a coder in Kiambu, innovating solutions. A teacher in Birmingham, a nurse in Boston. A creator on TikTok, influencing through digital platforms. Leadership lives where courage meets connection. The diaspora, if awake, is Kenya's largest county. We are not away, we are around, surrounding Kenya. The revolution needs translators in every time zone, turning memory into movement, education into empathy, privilege into progress. Diaspora will be a chapter in Kenya's history. Children of Raila's revolution took the torch across oceans, kept it burning in every language. Freedom survives by crossing borders faster than fear. Look in the mirror tonight, wherever you are. You are part of the unfinished revolution. Carry it in your work, words, WhatsApp groups, children. The future of leadership is already awake in you.
And so, the story of one man becomes the story of a nation. The journey of Raila Amolo Odinga from Bondo to detention, from ballots to bridges, from protest to principle, becomes a mirror through which Kenya sees itself. A mirror of pain, a mirror of progress, a mirror of possibility. He was called many names: rebel, reformer, radical. But history will call him something simpler, necessary. Because every generation needs a conscience, and every democracy needs a dreamer who refuses to stop believing. This story was told not for nostalgia, but for navigation, to remind us that freedom is not an inheritance, it is a habit. And the unfinished revolution now belongs to those who still believe that Kenya can be just, honest, and whole. To the youth, you are the next chapter. To the diaspora, you are the bridge. To the elders, you are the memory. Together, you are the revolution's afterlife. Its living legacy, its heartbeat across time. From the prisons of the past to the promises of tomorrow, Kenya's story continues not in textbooks, but in people. This is not the end. It is a continuation in your work, your voice, and your choices. Because every act of integrity is a small rebellion against corruption. Every honest word is a protest against fear. And every dream that survives is a victory against despair. So wherever this finds you, in Nairobi, Nakuru, London, or Los Angeles, remember this. You are part of Raila's unfinished revolution. Carry it with grace. Shape it with wisdom. And when your moment comes, continue it. Produced by Bright Tales Books, in collaboration with The Diaspora Mirror. Written and narrated by John Kimani. Executive producer, Bright Tales Books. Stories that illuminate Africa. Creative direction, Diaspora Mirror Studios. Music and sound design, Bright Tales Audio Collective. Voice and visual production, HeyGen AI Cinematics. Dedicated to the men and women of Kenya's struggle for democracy and the youth now carrying their torch. Freedom is not what we inherit, it is what we improve. John Kimani, Bright Tales Books.